The United States calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza amid pressure to get critical humanitarian aid into the Palestinian enclave. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States has submitted a draft resolution before the United Nations Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza tied to the release of all hostages kidnapped by Hamas. It comes after a declaration by the UN this week of imminent famine in parts of Gaza and the Biden administration's concerns over Israel's plans to launch a ground invasion in Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken discussed the details of the resolution during an interview in Saudi Arabia before traveling to Egypt on Thursday.
Well, in fact, we actually have a resolution that we put forward right now that's before the United Nations Security Council that does call for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages. And we hope very much that countries will support that. I think that would send a strong message, a strong signal.
Blinken will meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv on Friday. We will get to the latest diplomatic efforts later, but first, joining us from New York is Laetitia Courtois. She's a permanent observer to the United Nations and head of delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Laetitia, thanks so much for joining us. Let's look at the situation in Gaza right now. The United Nations says half the population of Gaza is facing catastrophic hunger. There are shortages of food, of medicine, of water, and even the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, whom we just heard from, who initially said that food was getting through, he now says 100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. Those are his words. What is your assessment of the situation there?
Thank you very much for having me. The situation is past the critical point when it comes to access to basic essential needs such as food, medicine, and clean water. In the south, the population has swelled to 1.6 million, exacerbating what remains of the local infrastructures. The public health is a major concern as Gazans are forced to live in squalid condition, and access to food is getting worse and even more challenges as the day passes, as prices surge and the supplies dwindle. And that's just for the people in Rafah. For the further north you go, the worse the situation gets. And while humanitarian aid is trickling down, too little is able to reach those trapped in the northern part of the stream.
Right, you mentioned Rafah, that's in southern Gaza. There are at least 1.5 million people who are there in that area, many living in tents. You mentioned some of the conditions there under which they're living. Do they have access to any food? Are any food trucks getting through?
The food is getting into Rafah, but in insufficient quantities and not able to provide and cope with the fact that the system has been completely disrupted. So we have an extremely vulnerable population who is fighting every day to get food on their plate, skipping lunches, dinners several days in a row, really going hungry. And that is putting people in an extremely vulnerable situation.
Right, and Laetitia, I'm wondering how this is working because a report by Oxfam on Monday found that aid trucks are waiting for an average of 20 days to get into the enclave. Is there any sort of food distribution infrastructure in that part of Gaza right now?
The humanitarian assistance is really facing huge challenges to get where it needs to be distributed, understanding, as you mentioned earlier, that 100% of the population depend on humanitarian assistance for very basic survival necessities. So yes, it is entering, but not sufficiently in scale, scope, and speed to be able to maintain the population at decent levels. Food is a daily challenge, and we can consider that this is a need everywhere throughout the Gaza Strip.
Have these airdrops by the United States, food airdrops, have they helped in any way?
I mean, this is, as it was described by the countries launching those operations, the desperate measure. A desperate measure while the access roads, not only the Rafah crossing, but all access roads remain limited in supplying the Gaza Strip. They have had their impact, but it remains very limited, very punctual. And above all, it's also not necessarily reaching the most vulnerable where those assistance is dropped. The images we see is catastrophic. People are literally running and fighting to get us access to the little food that is being dropped into Gaza.
Right, there is another threat that people in Rafah are facing right now. You know, as we mentioned earlier on, Israel says it will go ahead with its invasion, with its assault on that particular area in Gaza, and that has led the United Nations Children Agency, UNICEF, to warn that if Israel moves forward with that ground invasion in Rafah, more children will likely die. The UNICEF spokesperson, James Elder, described some of the hardships that children are facing right there, right now.
The streets are full. Rafah is a city of children. It's 600,000 children now. It was only a couple of 100,000 people. It's 600,000 children. A lot of children, you can see the malnutrition creeping in. It's much worse in the north where children have starved to death, but it's happening here. We've never had so many children in Gaza in need of medical support, be it from malnutrition or sicknesses or the wounds of war, and barely a third of hospitals are partially functioning.
You know, Laetitia, there's a new acronym that's been spawned by this war. It's WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. They believe to be something like 17,000 children who fall in this category. What is the fate of children in the area, many of whom have lost their family, lost both parents?
I mean, the load and the impact it has on children is unbearable. It's just appalling to see so many victims, children being killed, but also being completely abandoned by their families because they are too often, the only ones remaining alive. It's extremely difficult to have them reconnect with the social system. It's also excruciating to see as well children being cared in hospitals in very, very difficult situation. We know that this healthcare system is on its knees. Very few hospitals remain functional. None is able to fully function and to provide for the immensity of healthcare needs, and that includes the children. So we are very, very concerned about the toll that this conflict is having on the children in Gaza.
Hamas is holding more than 100 hostages right now. What efforts is the International Committee of the Red Cross making to get access to these hostages, to find out about their welfare, their health, and the conditions under which they're being held?
From day one, we've been calling for an immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. We've been clearly stating that this is prohibited according to international humanitarian law, and that those people need to be released as quickly as possible. In the meantime, we also call for them to be treated with dignity, have access to medical care, and also that we are allowed to visit. Unfortunately, we have not been able to do so, despite of constant and regular work to get access to them. So we continue to call for them to be released. We are ready as soon as the parties agree as well to the modalities to facilitate, as we have done in the last agreement that was reached by the parties, but the parties need to get to that agreement the fastest possible.
And what about Palestinian detainees being held by Israel?
We have as well said very publicly that the Palestinian detainees are also entitled to be treated as per their rights and with dignity. We have not been able to access them since the 7th of October. We have been calling for that access to be resumed, but also for them to be in contact with their families and to be treated adequately.
Laetitia Courtois, thanks so much for joining us. Well, for more now, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Jerusalem is Daniel Seidemann. He's a lawyer, expert on Jerusalem, and the founder of the Israeli non-governmental organization Terrestrial Jerusalem. Here in Washington, D.C., Khalil Jahshan is a Palestinian-American political analyst and executive director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And Nabil Khouri is a former U.S. diplomat who worked in the Foreign Service with the U.S. Department of State for 25 years. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Nabil Khouri, let me start with you. You've been at the State Department. You've worked there. Let's start with these diplomatic efforts by the United States to get a ceasefire. And as we heard, that draft calls for an immediate ceasefire, quote, tied to the release of hostages, unquote, these hostages being held by Hamas. But there is nothing about the Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel. And one of the demands, one of the conditions rather, that Hamas has made for the release of hostages is the release of Palestinian prisoners. So what do you make of this resolution?
We haven't seen a full draft of this, so we don't know the exact wording, and there's always going to be negotiations before a final draft is accepted. But one thing that troubles me is the duration of it. The administration has been talking about a temporary ceasefire for 6 weeks. The Secretary of Defense, even today, released a statement on his discussions with Gantz from Israel. And he's also talking about a temporary ceasefire. He is also talking about alternatives. So the administration is trying to dissuade Netanyahu from a full ground invasion of Rafah. But there are military discussions between the US and Israel as to alternatives. How else can you attack Hamas in Rafah, but without a full-scale invasion? In other words, ceasefire or no, the goal, and Secretary of Defense mentions this specifically, the shared goal of defeating Hamas is still on the table, and that's what the two sides are negotiating. So with all this, I'm afraid that I don't take the resolution very seriously. Obviously, any ceasefire would save lives, but we'd like to see something that has more duration. And we'd like to see this shared goal of continuing to fight Hamas set aside while you talk about peace.
Daniel, what is your reading of what we know about this draft resolution right now? I mean, as I said, that one of the things that Hamas talked about is this exchange, that they will release the hostages in exchange for Israel releasing prisoners. So assuming this does pass in the United Nations Security Council, I mean, can it be implemented? Will we see a ceasefire?
I would hope it would contribute to a lasting ceasefire, but that can't be guaranteed. I must say I am encouraged by the United States resolution. Much of what we've been witnessing over the last several months, since October 7th, is the result of Israel not being held accountable for our actions. Now, this in no way justifies or condones the savage massacre of Hamas on October 7th. But we have allowed this conflict to careen out of control based on accountability. We paid no price. And finally, we are beginning to see from my friends in the United States, some of Mr. Khouri's colleagues, who are saying, no, you are accountable for what is happening. I can't tell you how much I would like to disagree with Laetitia Courtois and say, it's not true. I've tried to convince myself it's not true. It is true. I believe that any ceasefire at this point is positive, that the priority must be simultaneously the return of the hostages and the end of the carnage and humanitarian assault on Gaza. And if it needs to be a temporary ceasefire in order for that to happen, I really wish it would be permanent from the get-go. But if it needs to be temporary in order to be prolonged, so be it. The hostages have to be returned at all costs. The carnage in Gaza has to stop at all costs. Get that done, and we'll proceed from here.
Khalil, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is, of course, says that they will go ahead with that military assault on the Rafah area of southern Gaza. That's despite U.S. warnings that if that does go ahead, it's going to result in many, many more civilians being killed. Let's listen.
We have an argument with the Americans about the need to enter Rafah, not about the need to eliminate Hamas, the need to enter Rafah. We see no way to eliminate Hamas militarily without destroying these remaining battalions. We are determined to do it.
Now, the offensive is still weeks away, according to some military analysts, because Israel doesn't have the sufficient number of troops to carry out this kind of operation in southern Gaza. But when it comes to what the United States can do, what the United States is doing, can it use what many believe to be its considerable leverage against Israel?
Well, with all due respect to the officials, both on the American side and on the Israeli side, actually the attack on Rafah is unfolding on a daily basis. I mean, we're losing dozens of people every day. And the difference is what? Like killing on a retail basis versus wholesale basis is Talmudic semantics as far as I'm concerned. You know, when I see the daily bleeding that's taking place, 5 here, 10 there, 15 here, and so on, that's adding up. I mean, we are now at what, like 34,000 killed, mostly civilians thus far, even when you deduct the alleged number of fighters killed. But the fact of the matter, as you just implied or stated, the cabinet did decide last Sunday that the invasion of Rafah is going to happen in anticipation of the arrival of the Secretary of State after his statements in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. Ron Dermer, who is supposed to be on his way soon to Washington to discuss this matter with the administration, declared that Israel is determined to invade Rafah, even if, these are his words, even if the whole world stands against us. So yes, Israel is determined. With all due respect to the UN draft resolution, frankly, it's an exercise in PR. It doesn't have the detail of the actual negotiations that the parties are focusing on. It simply is, I think the US is using the draft resolution as a leverage or a point of pressure on the Arab side, particularly on the Hamas side. And making the necessary linkage, you know, tying the ceasefire. Most importantly, I mean, they did characterize the ceasefire as immediate, which hasn't happened in the past, and maybe more lasting than they did in the past. But at the same time, they are linking it with the hostage release, which is part of the negotiations taking place in Doha. They should focus on the negotiations. I don't think this resolution is going to contribute to anything. As I said, it's all this effort in the media by the administration to leave the impression that it's ratcheting up pressure on both sides, including the Israeli side. That sense of toughness, frankly, is in the eye of the beholder.
Daniel, we have heard these warnings from the Biden administration, from the president himself, who said that Israel has gone over the top, to use his words. At other times, they've said that the Israelis need to be mindful of the number of civilians that have been killed. But we see Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu using his influence with the United States Congress to, in a sense, get around the White House. I mean, we've just seen that. He held a meeting with Republicans in the U.S. Congress, and they reiterated their support for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for Israel as well. And it came just days after the top Democrat in the U.S. Senate, Chuck Schumer, called for Netanyahu's ouster. He wanted new elections. He wanted to see the Prime Minister step down. I mean, how would you characterize the relationship right now between Netanyahu and the Biden White House?
I don't believe that President Biden has any illusions as to who Netanyahu is. What he does with that is entirely a different matter. I believe that we in Israel are unaware of what has transpired since October 7th. It was building before October 7th, but it is now crystal clear. Support for Israel has not declined. Support for Israel has collapsed. Decent people of all convictions find it very difficult to support a regime such as the Netanyahu regime. I believe that President Biden is engaging Israel in a way that has not happened in the past. Is it enough? Not yet. But the final word has not been said. I'd like to conclude with just one possible scenario. I've never met Netanyahu, but I've played chess with him on these things for the last 30 years. I don't believe that Netanyahu wants to go into Rafah. I think he knows that it will be a disaster all around and will drive Israel into abject isolation. But he wants Biden to stop him. He wants to have Biden stop him so he can say to his ultra-nationalist base, I didn't volunteer to do this. And it is this Democrat who stabbed us in the back. It is the stab in the back plan. I think that friends of Israel in the administration, in Europe, and in the Arab world should engage with us very seriously. We will not countenance an extension of this war in Rafah in order to perpetuate the rule of Benjamin Netanyahu. The only thing that is driving Netanyahu at this point is his own political survival, and most Israelis understand that.
Khalil, what do you make of Daniel's assessment of his analysis there?
I agree with Daniel's analysis on this particular point, definitely. I think it's a blame game that Netanyahu is engaging in. He is the usual opportunistic politician. We've seen him do the same thing, intervention in internal domestic affairs of the United States during his more than a dozen of years as prime minister. He has done it in the past, pitting the U.S. Congress versus the White House. It has worked partially for him in the past, and he seems to be trying to do the same. What he wants right now is the U.S. to succeed in asking Israel, if you will, and convincing maybe his government, the Netanyahu government, of delaying or canceling, as a matter of fact, the onslaught on Rafah so that he could blame the United States. Because he knows what's going to follow that. He knows the disaster that's going to happen, even if he cancels the attack, because the damage has been done. And Israel is going to face some serious political disaster domestically, and he wants all the blame to go basically in the direction of the White House.
Nabil, getting back to the conditions in Gaza right now, the UN says a famine is likely in the area by the end of May. And there are top officials in the Biden administration who say that Israel's actions, not in the Biden administration, rather, there are top officials who say at the UN that Israel's actions may amount to using starvation as a method of war, and that's a possible war crime. Here is Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Let's listen to him.
The extent of Israel's continued restrictions on the entry of aid into Gaza, together with the manner in which it continues to conduct hostilities, may amount to the use of starvation as a method of war, which is a war crime.
So, Nabil, the United States has said that it will be constructing some kind of offshore pier to get aid into Gaza, to get food, to get other supplies like medicines into the territory. But their critics will say, look, this is not going to work effectively. It's more theater. It's more symbolic than an effective way to break the siege. How do you see it?
It is theater, and to some extent, the Biden administration is trying to respond to strong public criticism in the U.S. For its policy and for its blind support to the Netanyahu government. With an ally like Israel, the U.S. should be able to work jointly on the ground to funnel all the aid that they could possibly funnel into Gaza. The fact that they have to build a pier, which is very expensive, very iffy, has not been approved by the Israeli government yet, is a sign of either desperation or, frankly, a stupid shenanigan, theatrical measure. Unfortunately, I mean, I think Dan, what Dan said about the politics from Netanyahu's point of view also applies here in the U.S. I think the Biden administration is thinking of cost-benefit analysis in terms of the upcoming election. They don't want to be outdone in their support for Israel by Trump and the Republicans. And at the same time, they don't want to lose the Arab American support and the left and liberal votes that have gone with Arab Americans. But for the one side that he needs, he gives real support, including military and intelligence. For the Arab American side and the liberal side of things, he raises the tone a bit about how much sympathy he has for Palestinian casualties. Even if the war stops today, and stops for good, and we certainly hope it would for everybody concerned, the Biden administration has been complicit in one of the worst humanitarian disasters since World War II. Nothing can wash that away, and they can live with that if they have any conscience for the rest of their lives.
Daniel, you referred a moment ago to this possible invasion of Rafah and why Prime Minister Netanyahu may not go ahead with that. Well, there's been one other development here in Washington. According to Politico, the Washington-based political newspaper, Biden will, quote, consider conditioning military aid to Israel if the country moves ahead with that large-scale invasion of Rafah. That article cites its sources as 4 unnamed U.S. officials. That would certainly turn the screws on Netanyahu, on Israel, if that is true. But how do you think this kind of threat would be seen in Jerusalem?
The attempt or the imposition of limitations on the provision of weapons would be considered to be scandalous, outlandish, an abandonment of Israel, and every expletive you could have in mind. Having said that, President Biden has expressed in word and in deed his support of Israel, perhaps more than was expeditious for him. And I don't think that the vilification of Biden is going to work. I'm an Israeli. I want my government to make the correct decisions. Obviously, it has made decisions that we will have to live with for the rest of our lives. Having said that, I welcome accountability for Israel. If Israel engages in policies that entail carnage, large-scale humanitarian devastation, deaths of innocents, and if the United States were to say, if you proceed, we will not be sending weapons that will allow you to do this. As much as this genuinely disturbs me, it really does, I would welcome a step like that.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.